It was the biggest secret of the Second World War, a place where almost 10,000 people worked in total silence. They were breaking more than 4,000 enemy messages every single day by the end of the war. Their work is said to have shortened the conflict by at least 2 years, saving millions of lives. And yet, for 30 years after the war ended, almost no one knew it existed. The people who worked there couldn't even tell their families what they did. They took their secrets to the grave. This place was Bletchley Park. What really happened behind the high walls of this Victorian country estate? How did a group of eccentric academics, crossword puzzle champions, and ordinary women who were just doing their duty manage to crack the most complex codes ever created? How did they build the world's first programmable digital computer in complete secrecy? And what happened to all that knowledge when the war was over? The story of Bletchley Park isn't just a war story. It's a story about the birth of the information age. It's a story of human ingenuity against industrial-scale secrecy. It's a story full of secrets that are still being uncovered today. Number 15, was it all about Cambridge geniuses? When you think of Bletchley Park, you probably picture a handful of men in tweed jackets, smoking pipes, pacing around a dusty room. People like Alan Turing, the brilliant and troubled mathematician, and yes, there were people like him, or the government code, and Cipher School, or GCNCS, actively recruited from Britain's top universities, Oxford and Cambridge. They sought out mathematicians, linguists, and chess champions. Dilly Knox, a classicist and one of the original senior codebreakers, was a perfect example of this type. He was an eccentric who did his best work in the bath. These were the boffins, the intellectual core of the operation. Their work was absolutely critical, but they were a tiny fraction of the people there. By 1945, nearly 10,000 people worked at Bletchley Park and its outstations, and over 75% of them were women. That's around 7,500 women. They were not all famous mathematicians. Most were ordinary people who answered a call of duty. They were recruited from all walks of life. Some were debutantes from high society, chosen because it was assumed they could keep a secret. Others were bright young women who had just finished school. The Women's Royal Naval Service, or WRENS, played a huge role. So did members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force and the Auxiliary Territorial Service. These women weren't just making tea. They were doing the hard, essential work of code breaking. They operated the massive bomb-B machines, the electromechanical devices that hammered away at Enigma's settings day and night. This was noisy, physically demanding work. They had to load heavy drums of wires, listen for the machine to stop, and meticulously record the results. A single mistake could waste hours of work. Women worked as slip readers, painstakingly comparing long strips of decrypted text to find linguistic patterns. They were indexers, creating a massive cross-reference card catalog of every decrypted message, a kind of analog search engine. This index was the memory of Bletchley Park. Without it, isolated pieces of intelligence would have been useless. And Jean Valentine, who started working at Bletchley Park as a teenager, described operating the bomb machine. In interviews for the Bletchley Park Trust, she spoke of the constant noise and the pressure of the work. She knew it was important, but she had no idea of the bigger picture. She just knew her job was to find the moment the machine found a possible Enigma key. The women of the Newmanry, the section run by Max Newman, operated the Colossus computers, the machines that broke the high-level Lorenz cipher. They had to understand complex wiring diagrams and set up the machines for each new problem. This was highly skilled technical work. The book The Bletchley Girls by Tessa Dunlop uses personal testimonies to paint a vivid picture of what life was like for these women. They worked in freezing cold wooden huts in winter and sweltering heat in summer. They worked long, grueling shifts around the clock. They lived in billets in nearby towns and villages, often with strict rules and little comfort, and they did it all under the weight of the Official Secrets Act. They couldn't talk about their work with anyone. Not their friends, not their parents, not their husbands. For decades, their contribution was almost completely erased from history. When the first books about Bletchley Park appeared in the 1970s, they focused on the male cryptanalysts. The vast female workforce was reduced to a footnote, so the image of Bletchley Park as a place for female geniuses is a myth. It was a massive industrial-scale intelligence factory, and it was powered by women. They were the engine room of the whole operation. The famous codebreakers couldn't have done their work without the thousands of women who operated the machines, managed the data, and kept the whole system running. It was a collaboration on a scale never seen before. It relied on everyone, from, the person delivering the mail to the person who finally cracked the code. What other vital roles performed by thousands of people have been completely overlooked by history? How many women possessed extraordinary analytical skills, but were never given the chance to become senior cryptanalysts because of their gender? If the Official Secrets Act hadn't been so strict for so long, how would our understanding of women's roles in the war have changed? And how many of the brilliant women of Bletchley Park spent the rest of their lives doing mundane jobs, their true potential never recognized by the outside world? Number 14, what was the official story? You couldn't just put up a sign that said Top Secret Codebreaking Center. Bletchley Park needed a cover story. And the one they came up with was perfectly, ridiculously British. The official story was that it was Captain Ridley's shooting party. The first codebreakers who arrived in 1938, as war seemed inevitable, were told to blend in. They were a group of Londoners who had come to the countryside for a weekend of shooting. The name stuck. Locally, Bletchley Park was known as BP. Some thought it stood for the local council, Bletchley Park Urban District Council. Others thought it was a military hospital or a training facility. The sheer dullness of these possibilities was part of the camouflage. The secrecy was absolute. It was managed by the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6. Everyone who worked there, from Alan Turing down to the kitchen staff, had to sign the Official Secrets Act. They were warned in the starkest possible terms. What you see here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here. Breaking this oath was an act of treason. The threat of prison was very real. This wasn't just about the war. The British government wanted to keep its code-breaking capabilities a secret from everyone, including its future allies and enemies. This secrecy created a strange, surreal world inside the park. People worked in different huts on different codes. Hut 8, which broke Naval Enigma, was not supposed to know the details of what Hut 6 was doing with the Army and Air Force Enigma. People who were friends and shared a room in their billets might work in different sections and be unable to speak a single word about their day. This compartmentalization was a key security principle. If one person was captured or turned out to be a spy, they could only reveal a small part of the whole operation. The physical security was also intense. The park was surrounded by a high-wire fence. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Everyone had to show their pass to get in and out. The book, The Secret Life of Bletchley Park by Sinclair McKay, details how this intense security was a constant presence. And dispatch riders on motorcycles would arrive and leave at all hours, carrying locked boxes of intercepted messages and intelligence reports. The constant hum of activity was hard to hide, but the shooting party story, and later the general assumption it was some kind of military administrative hub, seemed to work. There's no evidence the German regime ever suspected what was truly happening there. They believed their Enigma code was unbreakable. This arrogance was their single greatest weakness and Bletchley's greatest advantage. The silence lasted for decades after the war. In 1945, a general order was given. Destroy everything, machines were smashed to pieces, thousands of documents were burned in a massive bonfire. The people who had worked there went back to their normal lives. They became teachers, civil servants, housewives. And they kept the secret. It was only in the 1970s, with the publication of books like The Ultra Secret by F.W. Winterbotham, that the story began to emerge. Winterbotham had been responsible for the distribution of the intelligence, codenamed Ultra, that came from Bletchley. His book, published in 1974, finally broke the silence. For many of the veterans, it was the first time they could finally tell their families what they had done during the war. Many had already passed away, taking the secret with them. The cover story was more than just a name. It was a whole culture of silence that was imposed on 10,000 people. It shaped their lives during the war and for a long time after. It was a psychological burden that they carried alone. The success of Bletchley Park was not just in breaking codes, but in keeping the secret of its own existence. How many local people knew something strange was going on, but chose to stay silent out of patriotism? Were there ever any serious security breaches that were successfully covered up and remain secret to this day? What was the true psychological cost for the people who had to lie to their loved ones for more than 30 years? And did the enemy's intelligence services ever get a single scrap of information about Captain Ridley's shooting party, only to dismiss it as too unbelievable? Number 13. How did you get a job breaking codes? You couldn't just apply for a job at Bletchley Park. There were no newspaper ads. The recruitment process was as secret and unconventional as the work itself. The government was looking for a very specific type of mind. They needed people who thought differently, who could see patterns where others saw only chaos. So they went looking for them in strange places. One of the most famous stories is about a crossword puzzle. In 1942, the Daily Telegraph newspaper hosted a competition. The challenge was to complete a cryptic crossword in under 12 minutes. The story goes that the military intelligence services monitored the competition. They invited the winners to a meeting in London. There, they were given another puzzle to solve. Those who passed were discreetly offered a job doing interesting work for the government. They weren't told what it was, only that it was vital for the war effort. This was how some of the codebreakers were found. It was a test of lateral thinking and the ability to work under pressure, but the main source of the top cryptanalysts was the academic world. Before the war, GCNCS was a small, exclusive organization. It drew its staff from the intellectual elite of Oxford and Cambridge. They looked for people with specific skills. Linguists were essential, especially those fluent in German. Classicists were valued for their ability to reconstruct fragmented texts. Mathematicians, of course, were crucial. And they also looked for chess masters and other game players, people who were skilled in logic and strategy. A man named Alistair Denniston, the head of GCNCS, was the master recruiter. He had a knack for spotting talent. He famously recruited Alan Turing after Turing had published his groundbreaking paper on computable numbers in 1936. The recruitment process was often a quiet conversation. A university professor might be a secret talent scout. He would recommend his brightest students. They would be invited for an interview that felt more like an academic chat. If they seemed suitable, they would be asked if they wanted to serve their country. There was no job description. The details were kept deliberately vague. As the Bletchley Park operation expanded, this informal system had to grow. The armed forces began sending their brightest recruits. Young women from good families were recommended through social networks. The Women's Royal Naval Service Wrens became a major source of staff for operating the machines. They were selected for their intelligence and discipline. The book Codebreakers, The Inside Story of Bletchley Park, edited by F.H. Hinsley and Alan Stripp, contains first-hand accounts from the people who worked there.
Many describe their recruitment as a confusing and mysterious process. They were told to report to a train station, then to a country house.
They had no idea what they were walking into. What they all had in common was a certain kind of intelligence. Not necessarily formal academic brilliance, but a capacity for painstaking, logical work. They needed patience and an eye for detail. Codebreaking was not a single eureka moment. It was a slow, grinding process of collecting tiny clues, testing theories, and eliminating possibilities. It was about finding a single needle of sense in a haystack of gibberish. The people they recruited were often outsiders, or people who didn't fit neatly into the military hierarchy. Alan Turing was famously unconventional in his dress and manner. Dilly Knox was an eccentric who solved problems with flashes of intuition. The Bletchley Park authorities understood that they needed these kinds of minds. They created an environment that was more like a university campus than a military base. This was one of the secrets of its success. They gave brilliant people the freedom to think, to experiment, and to fail. They valued intellect over rank. A low-ranking officer could challenge a senior commander's idea if they had a better one. This flat structure was revolutionary for its time. How many brilliant potential codebreakers were missed because they didn't do crosswords or go to the right university? Did the recruiters ever get it wrong? And what happened to the people who couldn't handle the pressure of the secrecy? Were there other, even more bizarre recruitment methods that have never been revealed? And how much of the recruitment was simply down to luck? A chance conversation between the right two people at the right time? Number 12, who really broke Enigma first. The story of Bletchley Park often starts with the British, with Alan Turing and his team building the Bombay machine. But that isn't the whole truth. The foundations of their success were laid years before the war in Poland. The Polish Cipher Bureau was the first to make a serious breakthrough against the Enigma machine. Without their work, Bletchley Park would have been starting from scratch. They might have been years behind. In the 1920s and 30s, the Polish government was deeply concerned about its powerful neighbor to the west. They knew the German military was using a new cipher machine, the Enigma. In 1929, the Polish Cipher Bureau began a course in cryptology for gifted mathematics students at Poznan University. They selected 3 of the brightest: Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rosiecki, and Henryk Zygalski. These three young men would achieve the impossible. They would break Enigma using pure mathematics. The German military believed Enigma was unbreakable because of its complexity. The machine used a series of rotors that scrambled the letters of a message. The number of possible starting positions was astronomical. Trying to break it by brute force was not an option, but Rejewski had a brilliant insight. He realized that he could use mathematics to attack the machine's internal wiring, not just the daily keys. He used group theory, a branch of abstract algebra, to map the permutations created by the rotors. The Polish Bureau managed to obtain an early commercial version of the Enigma machine and some German operational manuals through French intelligence. This was a crucial piece of the puzzle. Using this information and his mathematical theories, Rejewski was able to deduce the wiring of the military Enigma rotors by late 1932. This was an astonishing achievement. Based on this work, the Poles built their own replicas of the Enigma machine. They also developed electromechanical machines to help find the daily keys. One was called the bomba, the Polish word for bomb. This was a direct predecessor to Turing's bomb machine at Bletchley Park. For years, the Polish team was able to read German military communications. But in 1938, the German operators made the Enigma machine more complex. They added more rotors and changed their procedures. The Polish methods became less effective. They needed more resources, more bombas, than they could afford to build. As the threat of invasion grew in the summer of 1939, the Poles made a historic decision. They decided to share everything they knew with their allies. On July 25, 1939, just weeks before the invasion of Poland, Polish intelligence officials met with their British and French counterparts in a forest near Warsaw. They revealed their entire operation. They gave the British and French a Polish-built Enigma replica each. They explained Rejewski's mathematical methods and the designs for their code-breaking machines. Alastair Denniston and Dilly Knox from Bletchley Park were at that meeting. As Simon Singh explains in the Codebook, this gift was the greatest secret of the war, handed over just in time. When the codebreakers at Bletchley Park started their work, they weren't starting from zero. They had a working Enigma machine. They had the mathematical groundwork laid by Rejewski. They knew it could be broken. This knowledge was a huge psychological advantage. It turned an impossible problem into an engineering challenge. Alan Turing's bomb was a far more powerful and versatile machine than the Polish bomba, but it was based on the same fundamental principles. The British contribution was to industrialize the process. They had the resources to build hundreds of bombs and employ thousands of people to run them. But the initial intellectual breakthrough belonged to the Poles. Their contribution was so secret that it wasn't fully acknowledged for decades. Without the Polish contribution, how many more years would the war have lasted? Could Bletchley Park have ever broken Enigma without the head start given to them by Marian Rejewski? Was the decision to share this vital secret the single most important act of intelligence cooperation in history? And what other secret contributions from smaller nations have been written out of the official histories of the war? Number 11. What happened inside the famous huts? Bletchley Park was not one single building. It was a sprawling campus of wooden huts. Each hut was a world of its own with a specific job to do. Life inside these huts was a mixture of intense intellectual focus and mind-numbing routine. This is where the real work of code breaking happened, step by step. The whole process was a production line designed to turn meaningless coded messages into useful intelligence as quickly as possible. It all started with the intercept stations all over Britain, and even overseas, wireless operators known as the WWII service listened to enemy radio traffic. They were often young women with a talent for languages. They would listen for hours, transcribing the Morse code into strings of 5-letter groups. These messages were then rushed to Bletchley Park by motorcycle couriers. The couriers were a vital link in the chain. They drove at high speeds in all weather to deliver their precious cargo. Once a message arrived at Bletchley, it went to a registration room. Here, every message was logged and sorted. Messages sent using the Enigma cipher were sent to Hut 6. The job of Hut 6 was to break the key for that day. This was the heart of the Enigma problem. The team in Hut 6, which included mathematicians Gordon Welchman and John Jeffries, would analyze the messages. They looked for operator errors and stereotypes. For example, many messages started with a weather report. If the codebreakers could guess a likely piece of plain text, a crib, they could use it to attack the code. The cribs and other information were then sent to the machine rooms in Hut 11. This is where the women of the Wrens operated the bomb machines. They would set up the bomb bay according to the instructions from Hut 6 and let it run. The machine would click and clatter as its rotors spun, testing thousands of possible settings every minute. When it found a possible solution, it would stop. The Wren operator would record the setting and send it back to Hut 6 to be tested. If it worked, they had the key for the day for that particular Enigma network. Once the key was found, the original coded messages and the key were sent to Hut 3. Hut 3 was the translation and intelligence hub. The staff here were mostly linguists. They would set their own Enigma replica to the correct key, type in the coded message, and out would come German plaintext. But that wasn't the end. The German was often full of military jargon, abbreviations, and obscure references. The job of the intelligence officers in Hut 3 was to make sense of it. They had to evaluate its importance, cross-reference it with the vast card index system, and write a clear, concise report in English. In his book, Most Secret War, R.V. Jones, a key figure in British scientific intelligence, describes how crucial this final step of interpretation was. Raw data is useless until a human mind can see its significance. Hut 8, under the leadership of Alan Turing, did the same work as Hut 6, but focused exclusively on the more complex naval enigma used by the German U-boats. The two Huts were rivals, but they also shared information. Gordon Welchman designed a diagonal board for the bombing machine that dramatically increased its power. This was a crucial innovation that benefited the entire operation. Other Huts specialized in other codes. Some worked on Italian or Japanese ciphers. The Testery, run by Major Ralph Tester, worked on the complex teleprinter ciphers. This division of labor allowed for specialization and efficiency. It was a factory for secrets. What brilliant ideas were shared informally between Huts, over a cup of tea or a pint at the local pub, that were never officially recorded? How did the intense rivalries between different sections both help and hinder the overall effort? Were there Huts dedicated to breaking codes of other countries, including allies, that we still don't know about? And how many groundbreaking ideas were lost because the rigid compartmentalization prevented the right two people from ever talking to each other? Number 10, were the machines just glorified calculators? The machines of Bletchley Park were not just calculators. They were not designed to do arithmetic. They were machines built to perform logical operations on an industrial scale. They were the physical embodiment of the codebreakers' ideas, turning abstract theories into concrete results. Without them, the flood of enemy messages would have been impossible to handle. There were two main types of machine, each designed to fight a different kind of code. The bomb fought Enigma, the Colossus fought Lorenz. The bomb was an electromechanical device, a beast of whirring drums, and clicking relays. It was designed by Alan Turing, with a crucial improvement by Gordon Welchman. The problem with Enigma was the sheer number of possible settings. There were 159 million possible ways to set up the machine each day. The bomb's job was to reduce that number to a manageable few. It didn't find the answer directly. Instead, it found contradictions. The codebreakers would start with a crib, a piece of German text they suspected was in the coded message. They would set up the bomb to test this assumption. The machine's spinning drum simulated the rotors of several Enigma machines at once. It would then check setting by setting if the crib could possibly produce the coded text. If it found a logical contradiction, for example, if the letter A had to be encoded as itself, which Enigma could not do, it would discard that setting and move on. It was a machine for disproving theories at immense speed. When it found a setting that was logically consistent, it would stop. This didn't mean it was the right answer, but it was one of only a handful of possibilities that the codebreakers then had to check by hand. Over 200 bombs were built, mostly at the British Tabulating Machine Company in Letchworth. They were the workhorses of the Enigma operation. The other great machine, Colossus, was even more revolutionary. It was designed to break the Lorenz cipher, codenamed Tunny, at Bletchley Park. Lorenz was a far more complex system than Enigma. It was used for high-level communications between the German high command. Breaking it by hand was almost impossible. The breakthrough came from the work of Bill Tutte, a young mathematician. He figured out the logical structure of the Lorenz machine without ever having seen one. But his method required a huge amount of statistical analysis. It was too slow to do by hand. This is where Tommy Flowers came in. Flowers was a brilliant post office research engineer. He was an expert in using vacuum tubes, or valves, the forerunner of the transistor. He proposed building a massive machine using 1,500 vacuum tubes to automate the statistical work needed to break Lorenz. Many at Bletchley were skeptical. They thought a machine with so many valves would be too unreliable. But Flowers knew they were wrong. He pushed ahead, and his team at the Post Office Research Station at Dollis Hill built the first Colossus machine in just 11 months. The Colossus Mark I was working at Bletchley Park by February 1944. It was the world's first programmable electronic digital computer. It read the coded message from a paper tape at a speed of 5,000 characters per second. It then performed the complex logical operations that Bill Tudde had devised. It didn't find the key directly, but it worked out the settings of the Lorenz machine's wheels, which was the crucial first step. Colossus was a genuine revolution. It was a machine that could be programmed to do different logical tasks. By the end of the war, there were 10 Colossus computers working at Bletchley. Their existence was one of the war's deepest secrets. After the war, Flowers was ordered to destroy all the blueprints and diagrams. The machines themselves were dismantled. The world did not learn of their existence until the 1970s. For 30 years, the official history of computing started with machines like ENIAC in the United States, which was built after Colossus. The true origins of the digital age were hidden away in a British country house. How much faster could the development of computers have been if the existence of Colossus had been revealed in 1945? Are there other, even more advanced Bletchley Park machines whose existence was so secret they were completely erased from history? Did the engineers who built these machines ever get the full credit they deserve for kickstarting the digital revolution? And what might our world look like today if Tommy Flowers had listened to the skeptics and never built his machine? Number 9. What was the code harder than Enigma? Enigma is the most famous code of the war, but it wasn't the most secure. The German military had another, far more complex system. It was a teleprinter cipher used for the most important messages sent directly between high command and generals in the field. The British codebreakers called the machine Tunny, and the cipher it produced fish. The real German name for the system was the Lorenz SC42, and breaking it was one of Bletchley Park's greatest achievements. Unlike Enigma, Lorenz was not a portable machine for use in the field. It was a huge fixed piece of equipment that attached to a teleprinter. It worked by adding a stream of random seeming characters to the original message. This stream was generated by a set of 12 wheels, far more than Enigma's 3 or 4 rotors. The number of possible combinations was vastly greater than Enigma's. The German high command was so confident in Lorenz that they often used it to send long, detailed reports. They had no idea that a team at Bletchley Park was reading them. The first break came by accident. In 1941, a German operator made a catastrophic mistake. He had to resend a long message, but he typed the second version slightly differently, with a few abbreviations. But crucially, he used the exact same key setting for both messages. This was strictly forbidden. An intercept operator at the Y service noticed the 2 messages and realized their significance. They were sent to Bletchley Park, where a brilliant cryptanalyst named John Tiltman went to work. By comparing the 2 nearly identical messages, he was able to strip away the original plaintext and isolate the stream of obscuring characters that the Lorenz machine had produced. This was the raw material, but they still didn't know how the machine that produced it worked. That task fell to Bill Tutte, a young chemist and mathematician who had recently arrived at Bletchley. He spent weeks studying the long strings of characters from the 2 messages. Using just pencil and paper, he began to find patterns. He deduced that the machine must have wheels. He worked out how many teeth were on each wheel. Slowly, painstakingly, he reverse-engineered the entire logical structure of the Lorenz machine. He did this without ever seeing the machine or even knowing what it was called. It was a feat of pure mental deduction, one of the greatest intellectual achievements of the war. But even with this knowledge, breaking Lorenz messages was incredibly slow. It required complex statistical analysis that took weeks to do by hand. This is where Max Newman's section, the Newmanry, and Tommy Flowers' Colossus computer came in. Colossus was designed for one purpose: to automate the methods developed by Bill Tutte and his team. It could perform the statistical calculations in hours instead of weeks. This made it possible to read Lorenz traffic in near real time. The intelligence gained from Lorenz, known as Tunny Ultra, was of the highest quality. It was coming directly from the top. Bletchley Park was able to read messages between the German leader and his field marshals. They knew about troop movements, strategic plans, and assessments of the war's progress. They had a direct window into the minds of the enemy's high command. The information was so sensitive that it was shared with only a handful of top Allied leaders. The intelligence from Tunney was vital for the planning of D-Day and for understanding the enemy's response to the invasion. The story of Lorenz and Colossus is less famous than Enigma and the Bomb, but it was just as important, if not more so. It showed that even the most complex code could be broken by a combination of human genius and machine power. Did the German High Command ever have even the slightest suspicion that their most secret communications were being read? What other unbreakable codes were being used during the war that we still know nothing about? How many other crucial breakthroughs depended on a single human error, like the one made by the German telegraphist? And if that one operator had not made that one mistake, would the Lorenz cipher have remained unbroken for the entire war? Number 8. How did they get the enemy's secrets from the sea? Code breaking wasn't just an intellectual exercise, it was a deadly serious part of a real war. Sometimes, to get the secrets you needed, you had to physically take them from the enemy. Bletchley Park needed codebooks, Enigma machine parts, and any other cryptographic material they could get their hands on. These materials were the raw data that helped them break the codes, and some of the most dramatic stories of the war involve the desperate attempts to capture these secrets from sinking German U-boats. This was known as a pinch. The naval enigma used by the U-boats was particularly hard to break. The German Navy had much stricter procedures than the Army or Air Force. By early 1941, the U-boats were devastating Allied shipping in the Atlantic. Bletchley Park was struggling to read their messages. They were in the dark. The codebreakers in Hut 8, led by Alan Turing, were under immense pressure. They needed a pinch. One of the first major successes came in May 1941. The British Navy located the U-boat U-110. In a battle, the U-boat was damaged by depth charges and forced to the surface. The German crew abandoned ship, believing it was sinking. But it didn't sink immediately. A boarding party from the British destroyer HMS Bulldog leapt onto the U-boat. Inside, they found a treasure trove, a complete Enigma machine with all its rotors. The codebooks for the next few months. Charts, logs, everything. They managed to transfer the material to their own ship just before the U-boat finally sank. The capture was kept a complete secret. The German Navy believed the U-110 and its crew had been lost without a trace. This pinch was a massive breakthrough. It allowed Hut 8 to read the naval enigma traffic for a crucial period, helping to turn the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. Another famous story is that of the weather ships. The German Navy used ships disguised as trawlers in the North Atlantic to send back detailed weather reports. These reports were vital for U-boat operations. They were also a potential weakness for the codebreakers because the messages had a predictable structure. In 1941, the British Navy launched operations to capture several of these ships. In May, they captured the Lauenburg. In June, they boarded the München. Each time, they found Enigma machines and code documents. These captures provided vital clues for the codebreakers. Perhaps the most heroic and tragic pinch occurred in October 1942. The British destroyer HMS Petard was attacking the U-boat U-559 in the Mediterranean. The U-boat was forced to the surface as the German crew abandoned ship. 3 British sailors, Lieutenant Tony Fasten, able seaman Colin Grazier, and a young canteen assistant named Tommy Brown, swam across to the sinking submarine. In pitch darkness, surrounded by rising water, they searched for the codebooks. Fasten and Grazier found the vital documents and passed them up to Brown on the conning tower. Just as Brown got clear, the U-boat suddenly sank, taking Fasten and Grazier with it. They died to save the codebooks. But their sacrifice was not in vain. The documents they recovered contained the keys for the short weather cipher used by the U-boats. This information allowed Bletchley Park to break back into the main naval enigma for a crucial period. Fason and Grazier were posthumously awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest award for civilian bravery. These pinches were desperate, dangerous operations. They were a reminder that the war of wits was fought with real lives. The information gained was priceless. It gave the codebreakers the raw material they needed to do their work. It was a direct link between the violence of the war at sea and the quiet, intellectual work being done in the huts of Bletchley Park. How many other secret capture operations were there that have never been declassified? Were any of the pinches deliberate traps with false information planted by the enemy? What was the real number of sailors who died in the effort to capture cryptographic materials, and did the codebreakers at Bletchley Park ever get to meet the men who risked their lives to get them the information they needed? Number 7. What was it like to live with such a secret? Imagine knowing the date and location of a planned enemy attack. Imagine knowing that hundreds, maybe thousands of people are about to die. Now imagine you can't tell anyone. You can't warn your family or friends. You just have to go about your day, carrying this terrible knowledge with you. This was the reality for the 10,000 people who worked at Bletchley Park. The psychological pressure was immense. The Official Secrets Act was not just a piece of paper they signed. It was a way of life. It governed every conversation, every letter home. They were told that careless talk cost lives, and they knew it was literally true. If the enemy ever discovered that their codes were being read, they would change their systems. The vital source of intelligence would dry up. The war could be lost. This was the burden they all shared. Your life at Bletchley was a study in contrast. Inside the park, they were at the nerve center of the war, dealing with life and death information every minute of the day. But outside the gates, they were expected to be ordinary people. They lived in billets in nearby towns and villages. They had to make small talk with their landlords and neighbors, pretending they were doing some boring clerical work for the government. The lie became a part of their identity. Many of the veterans interviewed for projects like the Bletchley Park Oral History Archive speak of this split existence. They had one life inside the wire and another, completely separate life outside it. The work itself was relentless. Most people worked 3 8-hour shifts around the clock. The huts were often uncomfortable, either freezing cold or stiflingly hot. The food was basic wartime rations, and the work could be incredibly stressful. Code breakers would work for days on a single problem, getting more and more frustrated. The operators of the bomb machines had to endure the constant noise and the pressure of not making a mistake. There was a constant sense of urgency. Every message could be the one that saved a convoy or won a battle. To cope with the stress, the people at Bletchley Park created their own vibrant social life. There was a choir, an orchestra, a drama group, and a film society. They played sports. They went for walks in the countryside. They went to the pub. These were moments of normality in a completely abnormal world. It was a way to let off steam and forget, for a few hours, the secrets they carried. But even then, the rule was absolute. You did not talk about the work, even with your colleagues from other sections. The secrecy continued for 30 years after the war. The veterans went back to their lives. They became academics, lawyers, teachers, parents, and they kept their promise. They never spoke about what they had done. For many, this was a difficult burden. Their families never understood the true importance of their wartime service. Their great achievements were unrecognized. When the story of Bletchley Park finally came out in the 1970s, it was a profound release for many. But for others, the habit of silence was too deeply ingrained. Some veterans went to their graves without ever telling their closest relatives what they did to help win the war. The personal cost of this lifelong secrecy is impossible to measure. What was the true rate of stress-related illness or nervous breakdowns at Bletchley Park? How many friendships or marriages were damaged by the inability to share this, central part of their lives? Did the security services actively monitor the veterans after the war to ensure their silence? And for the people who knew the details of planned attacks on civilian areas, what long-term psychological scars did that terrible foreknowledge leave behind? Number 6, did the Americans know what was happening? The story of Bletchley Park is often told as a purely British affair, but that's not the full picture. The relationship with the United States was a crucial part of the story. It was a relationship that started with suspicion and rivalry, but grew into one of the most successful intelligence alliances in history. In the early years of the war, before the U.S. entered the conflict, Britain stood alone. Bletchley Park was a closely guarded secret. But as the war progressed, it became clear that cooperation was necessary. The United States had its own code-breaking operations focused mainly on Japanese codes. They had made a huge breakthrough with the Japanese diplomatic cipher, codenamed Purple. This was the work of the U.S. Army's Signal Intelligence Service, led by the brilliant William Friedman. The first real steps towards cooperation came in 1941. A team of American codebreakers secretly visited Bletchley Park. They were stunned by the scale of the British operation. They had nothing like the bomb machines or the industrial process for breaking Enigma. In return, the Americans shared their solution to the Purple cipher with the British. This was the beginning of a technology and intelligence exchange. An agreement was signed, known as the Brusa Agreement, in 1943, later the Ukusa Agreement, which formalized this cooperation. It divided up the world signals intelligence tasks between the two countries and established principles for sharing the results. This agreement is the foundation of the intelligence relationship that still exists between the UK and the US today. American personnel began to work at Bletchley Park. They were integrated into the existing huts. They brought their own perspectives and skills. This collaboration was not always smooth. There was a natural rivalry between the two groups. As the war went on, the sheer resources of the United States began to overshadow the British effort. The Americans built their own, more advanced versions of the bombing machine. They had more people, more money, and more industrial power. A book by Michael Smith, The Emperor's Codes, details the parallel and sometimes competing efforts of the Allied codebreakers. The cooperation was vital in the Battle of the Atlantic. British and American teams worked together to track the U-boat wolf packs. Bletchley Park would decrypt the messages, and the intelligence would be shared with tracking rooms in Liverpool, Washington, and Ottawa. This allowed the Allies to reroute convoys away from the U-boats and to send hunter-killer groups to attack them. It was a truly international effort. The relationship was managed at the highest levels. Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt were both keenly aware of the importance of this secret intelligence. The information from Bletchley Park, codenamed Ultra, was often shared directly with the White House. This intelligence shaped the major strategic decisions of the war, from the campaigns in North Africa to the D-Day landings. The Americans came to trust the British intelligence, and the British came to rely on American industrial might to exploit it. It was a partnership that worked because both sides understood that winning the war was more important than any national rivalry. The War of Wits was global, and it required a global alliance to win it. How much did the internal rivalries between the British and American teams slow down progress? Were there any major disagreements about how to use the ultra intelligence that affected the outcome of a battle? Did the Americans try to recruit Bletchley Park's top minds to work for them after the war? And how much of the technology developed at Bletchley Park was secretly transferred to the United States, forming the basis of the modern American surveillance state? Number 5. How did they use the secrets to win a single battle? The work done at Bletchley Park was not just an academic exercise. It had a direct, measurable, and brutal impact on the battlefield. Nowhere was this clearer than in the Battle of the Atlantic. This was the longest continuous military campaign of the war. It was a struggle to keep the sea lanes open for convoys bringing vital supplies from North America to Britain. For a long time, Britain was losing. German U-boats were sinking ships faster than they could be replaced. The country was facing starvation and defeat. Bletchley Park played a key role in turning the tide. The problem was the naval enigma cipher, codenamed Shark by the codebreakers. It was the most complex version of Enigma, and for long periods, Hut 8 could not break it. During these blackouts, the U-boats could operate with impunity. Allied convoys were sailing blind right into the path of the waiting wolf packs. The number of sinkings soared. The pressure on Alan Turing and his team in Hut 8 was unimaginable. The breakthroughs, when they came, were often the result of a combination of factors. The pinches of codebooks from captured U-boats and weather ships were vital. These gave the codebreakers a way back into the cipher. The development of more powerful four-rotor bombs also helped, but the real key was the painstaking analytical work. The codebreakers studied every message, looking for tiny clues, operator mistakes, or repeated phrases. They built up a deep understanding of German naval procedures. When Bletchley was able to read the Shark cipher, the effect was immediate and dramatic. They could pinpoint the location of every U-boat in the Atlantic. This intelligence was sent to the Operational Intelligence Center of the Admiralty in London. There, in a secret room, a huge map of the Atlantic tracked the position of every convoy and every U-boat. With ultra-intelligence, they could now see the whole picture. This knowledge was used in two ways. First, they could route the convoys around the U-boat patrol lines. A ship that is never attacked is a ship that delivers its cargo. This defensive use of Ultra was arguably its most important contribution. It saved thousands of ships and lives. Second, they could use the information offensively. They could send Royal Navy and Royal Air Force hunter-killer groups directly to the locations of the U-boats. The hunters became the hunted. The U-boat commanders were mystified. They couldn't understand how they were being found so easily in the vastness of the ocean. They never suspected their communications were being read. The historian Sir Harry Hinsley, who worked at Bletchley Park, estimated that the intelligence from Ultra shortened the war by at least 2 years. Much of that estimate is based on its impact in the Battle of the Atlantic. Without it, Britain might have been forced to surrender. The turning point came in the spring of 1943. Bletchley was consistently reading the Shark traffic. Combined with new technologies like long-range aircraft and improved radar, the Allies inflicted devastating losses on the U-boat fleet. In May 1943 alone, a period known as Black May for the U-boat arm, over 40 U-boats were sunk. The German Naval Command was forced to withdraw its submarines from the North Atlantic. The battle was not over, but its back was broken. The supply lines were secure. This victory would not have been possible without the silent codebreakers of Bletchley Park. Did the German Naval Command ever come close to realizing their codes were broken? And if so, what stopped them from changing the system? How many times did the Allies have to deliberately sacrifice a ship or a small convoy to avoid revealing that they knew the U-boat's locations? What was the emotional toll on the codebreakers who could see the U-boat positions on a map but knew it would take hours or days for help to arrive? And if Bletchley Park had failed to break the naval enigma, could the entire Allied war effort have collapsed in 1943? Number 4, could D-Day have happened without them? The D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, were the largest seaborne invasion in history. It was the beginning of the end of the war in Western Europe. The success of this incredibly risky operation depended on one thing above all else: surprise. The Allies had to convince the German High Command that the invasion was coming somewhere else. This was the goal of Operation Fortitude, the most complex deception campaign ever mounted, and it was a deception that was planned and monitored using the intelligence that flowed from Bletchley Park. Bletchley's role in D-Day was twofold. First, it provided the Allied commanders with an unprecedented level of insight into the enemy's own plans and preparations. By reading both Enigma and the high-level Lorenz ciphers, they knew exactly what the German military was thinking. They knew the strength and location of almost every German unit in France. They knew what their commanders thought of the Allied preparations. They could read the reports on the state of the beach defenses. This information, detailed in books like Ultra Goes to War by Ronald Lewin, was absolutely vital for the planners of Operation Overlord, the code name for the invasion. It allowed them to choose the landing sites, plan the assault, and anticipate the enemy's reaction. Second, and perhaps more importantly, Bletchley Park allowed the Allies to check if the deception was working. This Operation Fortitude was a massive bluff. The Allies created a Phantom Army, the first United States Army group, under the command of the famous General George S. Patton. This army was based in the southeast of England. It had inflatable tanks, dummy aircraft, and fake landing craft. It generated a huge amount of radio traffic, all designed to be intercepted by the Germans. The goal was to convince the German High Command that the main invasion was going to come at the Pas de Calais, the shortest sea crossing to France. Bletchley Park was the feedback loop. By reading the enemy's own intelligence reports and communications, the Allies could see if they were taking the bait. And they were. The decrypted messages showed that the German commanders were convinced the main attack would be at Calais. They kept their best panzer divisions there, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Even after the landings in Normandy began, the Lorenz decrypts showed that the German leader himself believed Normandy was a feint, a diversion from the real attack at Calais. He refused to release the reserve divisions to counterattack the Normandy beachhead until it was too late. This was the decisive contribution of Bletchley Park to D-Day. The codebreakers didn't just provide information. They made it possible to manipulate the enemy's perception of reality. They were playing a high-stakes game of poker, and they could see their opponent's hand. The intelligence from Colossus, breaking the Lorenz messages, was particularly important. It gave the Allied Supreme Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower, the confidence he needed to launch the invasion even when the weather was terrible. He knew the enemy was looking in the wrong direction. The success of D-Day was a triumph of military planning and courage. But it was built on a foundation of secret intelligence that came from the huts of Bletchley Park. How close did the German command come to seeing through the deception? Was there ever a decrypted message that caused panic among the Allied planners, suggesting the secret was out? If Colossus had not been ready in time to break the Lorenz cipher in early 1944, would the D-Day deception have been too risky to attempt? And how many of the soldiers who landed on the beaches of Normandy owed their lives to a secret they would never know, worked out by a codebreaker hundreds of miles away? Number 3, what was the psychological cost of knowing everything? The intelligence produced at Bletchley Park was codenamed Ultra. It gave the Allied leaders a godlike view of the battlefield. But with this knowledge came a terrible burden. The people who handled this information, both the codebreakers at Bletchley and the intelligence officers who distributed it, faced agonizing moral choices. They knew what the enemy was going to do, and sometimes, to protect the secret of Ultra, they had to let it happen. This was the Ultra dilemma. If you acted on every piece of information, the enemy would quickly realize their codes were being read. For example, if a U-boat reported its position and a British destroyer appeared out of nowhere to sink it, the German Naval Command would get suspicious. If it happened again and again, they would know it wasn't a coincidence. They would change the Enigma machine or its procedures, and the vital source of intelligence would be lost. So, to protect the source, the Allies had to be incredibly careful about how they used the information. This meant they had to create a cover story for every action taken based on Ultra. If they were going to attack a U-boat, they would first make sure a reconnaissance plane flew over the area. The attack could then be attributed to a chance aircraft sighting, not to secret intelligence. This principle was applied across the board. Every decision had to have a plausible non-Ultra explanation. This was a constant nerve-wracking process. The most famous and debated example of this dilemma is the bombing of Coventry in November 1940. A popular myth grew after the war that Winston Churchill knew the city was going to be the target of a massive air raid, but he let it happen to protect the secret of Bletchley Park. The historical evidence, as laid out by historians like Peter Calvacaresi in his book Top Secret Ultra, shows this is not true. The intelligence from Bletchley was not that specific. They knew a major raid was coming, codenamed Moonlight Sonata, but the decrypts gave several possible targets. It was not until the evening of the raid itself that the German navigation beams were detected pointing towards Coventry. By then it was too late to do much more than sound the air raid sirens, but while the Coventry story is a myth, the underlying dilemma was very real. There were countless smaller instances where a convoy could not be rerouted or a troop concentration could not be bombed for fear of revealing the source. The people making these decisions were playing a long game. They had to weigh the short-term cost in lives against the long-term benefit of keeping the ultra secret safe. It was a horrifying calculation. For the people at Bletchley Park, this was a constant source of stress. They would decrypt a message detailing a planned attack. They would pass it up the chain of command, and then they would have to wait powerless, listening to the news reports to see what had happened. They lived with the ghosts of the decisions they were a part of. This was a war of information, and information has a price. The psychological cost for those who had to manage the ultra secret was immense. They knew that their work was saving millions of lives in the long run. But they also knew that in the short run, their silence sometimes cost lives. It was a burden they had to carry alone, and in secret, for the rest of their lives. How many specific military operations were canceled or altered because of the risk of compromising Ultra? Are there still classified files that detail the deliberate sacrifice of Allied lives to protect the secret? What kind of long-term psychological support, if any, was given to the people who had to live with this knowledge? And who was responsible for making the final terrible decision of when to act on a piece of intelligence and when to let an attack happen? Number 2, why was it all destroyed? The war ended in 1945. For the people at Bletchley Park, it was a moment of triumph and relief, but it was immediately followed by a strict order to destroy everything. The evidence of the greatest intelligence achievement in history was to be systematically erased. This was not an accident or an oversight, it was a deliberate policy. Hundreds of the bomb machines were taken apart and smashed. Their parts were scattered and recycled. The 10 Colossus computers, the world's first digital computers, were dismantled. Their blueprints and circuit diagrams were burned. Tommy Flowers, the man who designed Colossus, was ordered to destroy all his records. He did so, wiping out the proof of his own genius. Thousands of pages of documents, decrypts, and reports were gathered up and incinerated in a huge furnace. The very huts where the work had been done were torn down in the years that followed. The goal was to return Bletchley Park to what it had been before the war, a quiet, unremarkable country estate. Why this obsession with destruction? There were two main reasons. The first was secrecy. The war was over, but the Cold War was just beginning. Britain's code-breaking capability was still a vital state secret. The government did not want its former enemies, or its new ones, to know how their codes had been broken. More importantly, they did not want their allies to know. The methods used to break Enigma and Lorenz could be used against other countries' codes. The new government intelligence agency GHQ, which grew directly out of Bletchley Park, would continue this work in the post-war world. They wanted to keep their techniques to themselves. The secret of Bletchley Park was too valuable to reveal. The second reason was denial. The German government and many other governments around the world continued to use cipher machines based on the same principles as Enigma for years after the war. Britain even sold surplus Enigma-type machines to other countries. As long as those countries believed the ciphers were secure, British and American intelligence could read their secret communications. Revealing that Enigma had been comprehensively broken during the war would have been a catastrophic blow to post-war intelligence gathering. So the secret had to be kept. This policy of total secrecy had a profound human cost. The 10,000 people who had worked at Bletchley were sworn to silence for life. Their extraordinary contributions to the war effort were officially non-existent. They could not put their real work on their resumes. They could not tell their stories to historians. They could not even share their experiences with their families. They were forgotten heroes. The official histories of the war were written without any mention of ultra-intelligence. The pivotal role of code-breaking in major battles was completely ignored. It was not until the 1970s that the silence began to break. The publication of books and the declassification of some documents finally allowed the story to be told. The veterans, by then in their 50s and 60s, could finally speak. In the 1990s, a campaign began to save what was left of Bletchley Park from developers. The Bletchley Park Trust was formed, and the site was turned into a museum. A working replica of the bomb machine was built. A team even managed to rebuild a Colossus computer based on a few surviving photographs and the memories of the original engineers. It was a race against time to save the history that had been so deliberately destroyed. What priceless documents were burned in the furnaces of 1945 that could have completely rewritten our understanding of the war? How many of the world's post-war conflicts were influenced by intelligence gathered using the secret methods of Bletchley Park? Did the order to destroy everything come from a fear that the public would not understand the moral compromises made to protect the ultra-secret? And what other great scientific or technological breakthroughs from the war were deliberately erased from history for the sake of secrecy? Number 1. Did a secret war station invent our modern world? When the last workers left Bletchley Park in 1946, they walked away from more than just a secret war station. They were leaving the birthplace of the information age. The work done in those huts between 1939 and 1945 did more than just win the war. It laid the foundations for the world we live in today. The legacy of Bletchley Park is all around us, in the computers on our desks and the smartphones in our pockets. The most direct legacy is technological. Colossus was not just a code-breaking machine, it was the first time that a large-scale programmable electronic digital computer had been built and used to solve a complex problem. The engineers and mathematicians who worked on it, people like Tommy Flowers, Max Newman, and Alan Turing, were pioneers of computing. After the war, many of them went on to work at universities and research labs. They took the ideas and techniques they had developed in secret at Bletchley and applied them to building the first generation of post-war computers. Machines like the Manchester Baby and the Pilot Ace computer were direct descendants of Colossus. The 30-year secrecy surrounding Colossus meant that these pioneers never got the public credit they deserved at the time. But their work quietly shaped the direction of the entire computer industry. Alan Turing's contribution is a prime example. His theoretical work before the war had defined what a computer was. At Bletchley, he saw how these theoretical machines could be built and used in practice. After the war, his detailed design for the automatic computing engine ACE was one of the first complete specifications for a modern stored program computer. His thinking at Bletchley Park on the nature of machine intelligence and the potential of computing was decades ahead of its time. The field of artificial intelligence is built on the questions he first started asking in those secret huts. But the legacy is not just about hardware, it's about the very idea of information. Bletchley Park was one of the first places to treat information as a commodity, something to be intercepted, processed, analyzed, and distributed on an industrial scale. The systems they developed for managing vast amounts of data, the card indexes, the cross-referencing, the intelligence reports, were a primitive form of what we would now call data science. They were dealing with big data. Before the term even existed, they understood that the value of information was not just in its content, but in the connections and patterns that could be found within it. The very existence of modern intelligence agencies like Britain's GHQ and America's NSA is a direct result of the work done at Bletchley Park. The UKUSA Agreement, the intelligence sharing pact signed during the war, is still the basis for global signals intelligence today. The methods of intercepting and analyzing electronic communications that were honed at Bletchley are the direct ancestors of modern digital surveillance. The war of wits never ended. It just went from a hot war to a cold war and now to a digital one. The final legacy of Bletchley Park is a human one. It proved that a diverse group of people, mathematicians, linguists, engineers, and ordinary men and women, could come together to solve a problem that was thought to be impossible. It was an environment that valued creativity and unconventional thinking over rank and tradition. It showed that complex problems require collaboration between different kinds of minds. In our own age, as we face huge global challenges, from climate change to pandemics, the story of Bletchley Park is a powerful reminder of what is possible when people work together in a common cause. It is a secret that should never have been kept, and one that we should never forget. If the Bletchley Park story had not been kept secret for 30 years, would Britain, not Silicon Valley, have become the center of the global computer industry? How much of the basic architecture of the internet can be traced back to the need to create secure and efficient communication networks during the war? Is the modern debate about privacy versus security a direct continuation of the moral dilemmas faced by the keepers of the ultra-secret? And in our world of constant information, what is the next unbreakable code, and who are the secret code breakers working right now to crack it?